Hi everyone. I was just listening to my friend Deepak's reflections on the lightness of being and the matrix of creation. And as he was speaking about the lightness of being and how it modifies through the matrix of creation and the matrix of all experience, I was thinking about consciousness and specifically how the difference between consciousness and conscious agents arises, right? So what does that mean? Well, the way we use the word consciousness differs depending on who you're listening to, what textbook you're reading, which thought system, thought pattern that we might subscribe to. In the Vedantic tradition, consciousness, at least the translation of consciousness into English as the word consciousness itself, is often used to communicate what is fundamental, the fundamental nature of reality, or what we might call being, right? So why are the words reality and being interchanged? Why can they be used interchangeably in some contexts? Well, because the word reality tends to have an objective connotation, right? When we say this is real, then we have a feeling that, oh, okay, that's what's fundamental. This word being, on the other hand, has a subjective flavor to it, right? That when we say being, that we experience being, or that being is what is fundamental, then it seems almost something that we can connect to because we are human beings after all. So the fact that these can be used interchangeably in this context means that what we're actually talking about is neither fundamentally objective nor fundamentally subjective, but that this kind of reality or this kind of being, or in this case the word consciousness, what this all refers to is the home that is beyond what we call the subject-object differentiation, right? Before I become an I and you become a you, what is the home where we both live? Where is the home we both live? And we're both living right now prior to our expressions as individuals. That place, if we can call it that, is what is referred to in this context by the words consciousness, by the word reality, by the word being, and such. Now, with the word consciousness itself, the key is that when we use consciousness typically in this society, it refers to our personal consciousness, right? So in medicine, for example, there's a common phrase which we say loss of consciousness. And what is loss of consciousness? It's basically when somebody passes out, right? So one of the diagnoses we give is a diagnosis of syncope. And what does syncope involve? Syncope involves when the body loses postural tone, right? So if the body is standing and then the postural tone leaves the body, meaning that the muscles that are held in a particular state of tension to allow the body to remain erect, if they loosen, the body falls, goes from a vertical position to a horizontal position, and in that time there can be a loss of blood flow because the blood that was flowing up to the brain in that moment when it falls down because that had stopped. And so the blood flow again resumes when the body is horizontal, right? So that's why syncope happens. The body says, hey, there's not enough blood flow going to the brain. I'm going to disengage the postural tone. The body goes flat, and now blood flow to the brain resumes. In between, there's what we call a loss of consciousness, and it often is just a few seconds, right? But what does that mean? That loss of consciousness basically means a loss of individual awareness of oneself, of the individual personality, right? It's not of the world itself. The entire world itself doesn't go blank, right? The world doesn't disappear. So consciousness, the way we use it typically, refers to this personal type of consciousness. And there are different levels of that too in medicine. For example, there's lethargy, there's obtundation, there's stupor, and there's coma. So these are the different levels of individual consciousness. Consciousness, as we're referring to it here, means something broader, right? It is that fundamental nature of reality. and we call it consciousness, right? Why do we call it that? If consciousness is used just as this particular thing, why are we referring to this broader reality as consciousness? Well, because there's a link between the two, right? So you can almost see the tip of the iceberg, the individual consciousness, as our individual personalities, right? The thoughts, the personal feelings, the personal emotions, the personal desires, they're all relative to that individual. But that personalized expression of consciousness, that tip of the iceberg, is a differentiated aspect of the depth of consciousness. And this depth of consciousness is that from which all things differentiate, not just the individual, not just all individuals, not just all living organisms, including plants, animals, fungi. No, we're talking about something more fundamental, which even differentiates and expresses as what we call material reality, right? Because as we know, this material reality, this apparently material reality, arrives to us only in consciousness. There has been no person, no organism alive that has experienced material reality without consciousness, right? Because it is that fundamental consciousness that even allows the capacity for perception. So these are two levels of consciousness. We can say there's an entire continuum, but for the purposes of understanding, there are these two levels, the individual expression, the individual layer, and there is what we might call fundamental reality. The reason this is so often misunderstood is because there is this anchor in the mind, in the world culture right now, that consciousness is personal, right? There's an anchor in the world culture, meaning in our world educational system. The way we teach kids that are growing up to become scientists and artists and musicians and anyone is that this idea of consciousness is that it's personal. And because of that, when we hear about consciousness and talk about it as fundamental reality, there can be a block to recognizing the truth of that. In fact, if we follow the thread from the tip of the iceberg down to the depths, we see that this external expression is simply a mirror and the reflection of this fundamental inner reality. And this is what Deepak was speaking about today as the lightness of being. Being itself, or consciousness itself, differentiating as this light show, as it were, refracting as this light show. So if we recognize these two levels of consciousness, then a big question is really, what is the difference between consciousness as fundamental reality and a conscious agent, which is what we're talking about as individuals? And this is a very interesting question, and it touches on a lot of different things, including AI, artificial intelligence, which is a big part of the conversation now. But let's look at the beginning of this, right? So what is the difference between consciousness itself and consciousness as fundamental reality and consciousness as a conscious agent? So a conscious agent is essentially a form of consciousness that has some kind of self-reflective capability, right? Or some kind of sub-identity. So if this I, that is the individual, has the ability to recognize itself as something distinct from the I that is fundamental reality, then this sub-I, let's call it a sub-identity, this sub-identity then becomes a conscious agent. Or what do we mean becomes? It has the experience of being a conscious agent, right? So you might have heard the phrase, I am that I am. It's in one of the religious traditions. I'm not sure which one it is. But this phrase, I am that I am, is essentially referring to this fundamental consciousness. Because nothing can be said about it other than I am that I am, or I am as I am, right? Because it can't be referenced against something else because there is no other, right? So there is no, I am big. There's no I am small. There's no even I am infinite, right? Because infinite only negates the finite and therefore assumes the finite to begin with. So none of these modifications can really apply or can really shed light on this nature of this I am, which is why this redundant statement is given, I am that I am. And in fact, it doesn't stop there. It's an ongoing statement. I am that I am, that I am, that I am, right? On and on, because once we go beyond that I am, the only thing that can happen is redundancy, because it is as it is. So this I, this essential I, as it differentiates, as it plays, as it mingles among itself, then as it does this, if there's an experience of sub-identity, meaning if the experience of a boundary happens, then this sub-identity is what experiences itself as a conscious agent. And this is what we traditionally refer to with pronouns in our society, right? So he, she, I, you, and even specific indicators like it, right? It is a thing that we project our sub-identity on, right? Makes sense? So I'm looking at a screen right now, right? And if I say, there it is, there's the screen, right? So that it that I'm seeing is something that I'm seeing because my own sub-identity as an individual has materialized, is being experienced. And when that sub-identity is experienced, it is projected out throughout the entire light show, right? That lightness of being which is differentiated, where the experience of a sub-identity occurs, there the experience of a world of sub-identity, including not just conscious agents, but specific things, occurs, right? So in this context, what is a conscious agent? That conscious agent is that sub-I, right? There's the I am that I am as I am that I am. When that I differentiates, this sub-I then projects what it sees into the world. And that's why when we talk about it's, right, an it or a that or a thing, those things, we can only know them in relation to ourselves, right? For example, right now, the hand that you're seeing and the hand that I'm seeing has to be different. And the traditional explanation for that would be that it's different because you're sitting in a different position than I am. Therefore, what you would see would be the palm. What I would see is the back of my hand. And that makes sense, right? But fundamentally, no matter how many people we have surrounding this hand, let's say we have 1 million people, each at a slightly different angle around this hand, nobody would be able to see what we call the hand itself. They could only see an aspect of this hand, right? Even if they have special devices to look through the hand, every angle, whatever is possible, would not be possible to actually experience what the hand is in its entirety, because no matter how many you have, they can only see an aspect, right? And there are infinite aspects from which we can see and experience this hand. So what is the it? What is the thing that is here that is presenting itself as all of these aspects? And I'm going to take a moment here to reflect on that. What is the thing? What is the it that we confer our identity on, our sub-identity on, which appears as that hand, right? The sub-identity confers its identity onto whatever it is that is here and recognizes that as the hand. That's the mind's superimposition, right? That is identified as a hand. But what is it that is fundamentally here? That is that original I am. That is the original existence or being or consciousness, right? So the original consciousness and the sub-identity both are here right now, right? And in fact, they are not different. But when looked at from the level of the sub-identity, it appears as a world of things. It projects its sub-identity and its ability to project on this I that is here on this consciousness and appears as this world of things. So given that, what is it that we're speaking about as a conscious agent? It's simply that ability to create and project boundaries. Yeah? The ability to create or imagine or experience boundary and thereby to project that on what we see, that is what is referred to as a conscious agent. And all ideas associated with that, like for example, destiny or free will or manifesting or choice, desire, all of these are aspects or associations of this experience of boundary, right? Because from the perspective of fundamental consciousness, there's no question about destiny nor free will, because all of these things occur in modified experiences of time and space. All right, so again, this difference between the fundamental consciousness, this undifferentiated state, which is right now, right? Which is right now. It is the now which differentiates into the mental experience of the conscious sub-identity, that conscious agent as past, present, and future, right? So fundamental consciousness, the fundamental reality, the nature, the essential nature of things, when experienced through the experience of boundary, now takes on the role of a conscious agent, right? So the boundaries that are seen, for example, the boundary around this hand or the boundary around this pen, this boundary is not some boundary that is out there. The boundary is experienced because the sub-identity itself is experiencing its own boundary and therefore confers that on the fundamental I am, the fundamental consciousness that is here, right? So it looks as though there is an objective world only to that sub-identity which does not recognize that its boundary is a transient experience. Right? Does that make sense? If it seems as though there is a pen here that is objective, right, then the reason that it feels objective or seems objective or we think that is objective, it is because we don't recognize that the boundaries that are being superimposed on this pen, because there have to be boundaries, right? If there is no perception of a boundary, we cannot delineate a pen, right? There has to be a boundary to say this is pen and this is space. Pen, space, and there's a boundary in between, right? So that boundary comes from the sub-identity projecting that. And we don't recognize that in our world culture because it's not taught, right? It's not taught in schools. Self-knowledge, unfortunately, is being left out of the curriculum in our schools. And what we are learning is to continuously direct our attention at the things around us. But the most important thing to recognize is this matrix, I'm going to use Deepak's words, this matrix that appears as a boundary, that is experienced as a boundary, and therefore that matrix converts all around us and begins to appear as this world of individual things. Now, this might sound wild. It might sound psychedelic. It is pretty wild. And it's also true. But I would ask you not to believe me or disbelieve me, but rather to experiment responsibly for yourself with your mind. Right? Begin to spend time with one's own mind and with the contours of the mind. And then one will recognize that this contour of the mind that appears and is experienced as a sub-identity appears in tandem with the contours of everything, with the contours of a desire, the contours of a feeling, the contours of a thought, the contours of an object, the contours of a perception, the contours of time, and the contours of space. All contours appear in relation with the contour of a sub-identity. And therefore, this conscious agent, which is the sub-identity, is simply this fundamental consciousness which is then putting on the cape of a boundary. All right, so this is the difference between consciousness and a conscious agent, right? And this then goes into the fundamental difference between what we call a living thing and a non-living thing, right? For example, a plant we would say is living, but we would say a pen is not living, right? Well, what is the difference? The difference is that plant has that experience of a sub-identity. Why? Because we recognize it. We say that the plant has a sub-identity and has its own ability to sense and to respond to the environment. Why? Because we can see some similar things, some similar activity in the plant as we see in ourselves. We tend to move, we tend to respond to the environment, and we can see the plant move a little bit. Like, for example, when the flowers or the leaves turn toward the sun, we can see plants growing, we can see plants decaying. So we look at that and say, hey, that kind of looks like me. Yes, that's alive because I feel alive. And that really is our fundamental criteria for how we diagnose life. But that plant that we're looking at and saying what it is, what we see of that plant is directly proportionate to what we see of our own sub-identity. And the greater the boundary of that sub-identity is seen through, the more we see what that plant fundamentally is. And the more we see what that plant fundamentally is, or the underlying nature that is then interpreted as that plant by the mind, the more we start to see the fundamental nature of all objects. And we start to see, hey, actually, yes, that plant is something beautiful. There's something that seems to be living about it, but in fact, all objects have a life of their own. And how can you say that? Because an object ultimately is not an object, right? It is something fundamental which is only appearing as that limited kind of expression, limited only by the own individual mind and the degree of its boundary. So this is the connection between fundamental consciousness, individual consciousness, which is a modification of this, and the apparently discrete, non-living things around us, right? In fact, there is only one, or better yet, in fact, there is neither multiplicity, nor duality, nor even the one. It is what it is, and really can't say much about it, but it is our fundamental nature. Thanks for listening.